Hi, I'm Mark Loftus, editor of Post Magazine.
And I'm Heath Firestone with CinemaTechnica. And today we're going to be talking about intermissions in films. This actually spawned from earlier conversations we had, in particular about Killers of the Flower Moon by Martin Scorsese. And there's been some developments since our conversations in our last video, which actually lead to a lot bigger conversation on the topic. So where do you want to start, Mark?
Yeah, well, the length of that film, Killers of the Flower Moon, it's 3 hours, I think 26 minutes. And you and I touched on the length of it and, how practical it was. But it seems like a lot of other people that have seen the film had criticism about its length, whether it was too long, whether it needed an intermission. And that led to apparently these theater chains here in the States and overseas that kind of went rogue and started introducing their own intermission to this film, unapproved by Paramount and Apple. And I guess they were trying to crack down on them, that this wasn't the way the film was meant to be consumed. So that being the case, you and I kind of got into a discussion and we started looking up some of the longer films that have been out there and whether they did or didn't have an intermission, and just some of our history and the practicality of it. And I thought it would be a good topic to kind of follow up on. I thought it was interesting, and it seems to be gaining momentum based on this particular film.
Well, and, it's interesting. I mean, probably no director, I guess, brings this topic into more focus than Martin Scorsese, because this is his fourth film that is over 3 hours long. He has 7 films that are at least 2 hours and 45 minutes and 11 films that are 2 hours and 18 minutes long or longer, which is kind of where the cut off from what in my research, when they used to do lots of intermissions, was, kind of if it's 2:15 or more, you generally put in an intermission. So that's a lot of movies to do that. There are other people who have done long movies, and even a series of them, including Peter Jackson with the Lord of the Rings films and that sort of thing. But, he's the last 2 films of his have both been really long. And I don't know, it's an interesting topic.
I didn't realize that he had a history of doing that many films. I think of Gangs of New York, and I think that was a long film, but it wasn't as long
The
as
Irishman,
this.
Obviously.
Irishman, sure. And now this one, obviously. But I never really thought of him as being a long filmmaker, overly long. And then when you bring up those type of statistics of how many were 3 hours, how many were 2+ hours, it's interesting that he's kind of built a resume of that many films. But there are other filmmakers out there that have done it. I did a little research we were trying to figure out how many of these really long films have there been in the past and more recently. And when the intermission was initially introduced, and obviously you had films like Gone with the Wind way back and stuff. And in the 50s, what I found out was that films that were being shown in 3D, there was a reason that these intermissions were being introduced. Films that were being shown in 3D would require 2 projectors to get that 3D effect. Now, typically you could have 2 projectors running a film, and one reel ends, the other projector is picking up the next reel, and you have a seamless, crossfade from one to the next. But when you're using both projectors to create that 3D effect, and your film reel ends, you have to stop, put more film on, or set up another reel and proceed. And that was why they introduced intermissions, so that they could have time to change the reels. Okay, it gave the audience a bit of a break to concessions, etc. But there was a technical reason why they did it. It wasn't just for a convenience type thing. It was like, well, we can't do what we want to do with these different projectors and the 2 different films. So that was it. And then, as you saw after the 50s, later in the 50s, Ben-Hur, 1959, was 212 minutes. Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962, that was 2 hours, 58 minutes. I remember seeing it on Turner Classic Movies with a intermission on, the television version. And it seemed to taper off a little bit later in the 60s. So that was just some interesting
late
research.
60s was definitely where it seemed to taper off most. I was looking at what films had intermissions in them, and one of the most recent ones that I saw when it was still happening fairly regularly was 2001: A Space Odyssey. But there have been newer movies, including Gettysburg, which was in 1993. That was a 4 hour and 31 minute film. So obviously you're going to have to do something in that sort of situation.
Wow. Yeah.
and there's been some other exceptions, but I mean it wasn't that uncommon for '60s movies to be really long. Cleopatra was in 1963 was over 4 hours long. Lawrence of Arabia, we talked about Gone with the Wind, Ben-Hur, but my top five were those five, and then The Irishman was the next one, and then Killers of the Flower Moon. So it's like it's right there with some of those really really long films from the '60s, but the difference is those ones had intermissions and these do not.
Yeah, I worked for a couple of different movie theaters when I was younger, college and stuff. And one of them was an independent theater. I later went on to work for United Artists, which was obviously a chain theater. And I was in the independent theater when Dances with Wolves came out, and that was 1990. And that film was 3 hours and 1 minute. And that was a long film at that time. And I remember, people in the audience kind of ducking out to use the restroom. At that time, you were allowed to smoke cigarettes in the lobby. They'd come out, they'd smoke a cigarette, they'd try to peek through the window and, keep up with the film while they were smoking a cigarette. So that was 1990, and that did not have an intermission. And I remember, wow, that's a long film not to have an intermission. But one film that I had forgotten about that was even longer, and I've heard that it had an intermission. I don't recall it having an intermission when I was working for United Artists at the time, but 1992's Malcolm X from Spike Lee with Denzel Washington got Academy Awards, and that was 201 minutes, 3 hours, 21 minutes. So that's comparable to
Yeah.
Killers of the Flower Moon. And again, I don't remember that one having it. So that was kind of like...
Well, and that's actually the same length as Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, which is also 3 hours and 21 minutes, which also did not have an intermission. And I have to admit, I didn't complain about that being as long as it was in the theater, even though it was really long. All the Lord of the Rings movies were in that 3 hour, 3+ hour movie, and then of course they had extended versions that were longer on DVD, but that doesn't count.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, I have other, friends and family that had worked in the movie theater, and we kind of like thought back to the days when we were there in college.
Well, Titanic is another one that I remember is really long. Titanic,
okay. And I said, do you remember
and Schindler's List?
Schindler's List, yeah.
Sorry.
Schindler's List. I said, do you remember anything that had it? Obviously Dances with Wolves, Malcolm X was one. One of the more recent ones that I heard had an intermission in it was The Hateful Eight, Quentin Tarantino. Now, I saw it in a press screening, and the press screening I saw did not have an intermission. So I don't know. It was 2 hours, 48 minutes. I don't know if it did for the commercial purposes or not, but when I saw it, it didn't. I saw it straight through.
And in my research, I found two films that are recent that had apparently special screenings that had intermissions in it, and that was The Irishman, which was Scorsese's last film, a really long film, and then Hateful Eight, which isn't as long, 2 hours and 48 minutes. But like you said, you saw a version that didn't have the intermission. But it's interesting that there was a screening version of it, but it wasn't what was actually released. So interesting stuff like that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is how this must be for smokers, because they need their nicotine fix, and maybe they go in with some nicotine gum or something like that. But I mean, these longer films must be a challenge for them to endure. Not to mention people who want. Well, I like to get popcorn when I'm at the theater, and you eat popcorn, it makes you thirsty, but you don't want to drink, or at least not drink too much if you know the film's going to be long. So that creates a challenge. So I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of an intermission just so that you can. But there's a psychological element too that I was thinking about. I was thinking about what other events do we have where it's so intense for so long without a break? At most workplaces require that you have some sort of a break every 2 hours, or at least when I worked in jobs like that, they said you had so you have your morning break, your afternoon break, and then a lunch break. However, and if you go to a sporting events, they always have intermissions. If you go to a play, there's intermissions. So intermissions existed before that. To me, it seems like maybe one of the things that also changed. They say it's the attention span has changed and how people approach things is different. But one of the things we saw in the 70s and 80s in particular was the advancement of, multiplexes. So you no longer had a single screening area and then a lobby area that people can come out to kind of wander around. And I mean, you still get concessions, but it's different, And so I wonder if that's one of the things that maybe, affected some of it. They're trying to get as many films in as quickly as possible and don't want the intermixing and knowing what theater people came from, if they're going to sit back down in time. I don't know. There's some complexities, I guess, to introducing
There
an
are
intermission.
complexities, and I was talking to some of my film theater friends from back in the day and family, and because we were all working there at these independent theaters and the local art theater and stuff like that, and there is a financial aspect to it, and one of them brought up the point that they understood the intermission as an opportunity to gain revenue. Take a break. You can go
Yeah.
out to this, the candy stand. You can get soda, popcorn, whatever. Because at that time, and it's similar today, is the theater was only getting a small percentage of the box office. The distributor and the studio was getting the most. And as a film goes on over the course of many weeks, that scale changes in balance, and the theater chain gets more money and the studio gets less. So you're making less money. You want to make it back up on the popcorn and the concession stand sales. So that was one way of thinking of it back then as an opportunity. Another reason that it may have changed is that back then you were dealing with film and you were dealing with the limitations of projection technology and a 20-minute reel of film and these different plates that they would be storing it on as it's going through the projector. And now it's digital, digital projection, digital distribution. So you're not tied to the limitations of, well, how much film can I fit on a platter? That's the word I was looking for. How much film can I fit on a platter? And, until the next platter has to be threaded up and run through the projector. And because of that, less need for a break in there from the technology standpoint. So those two things, concessions and improvements in technology where you don't have to have the break because of the film platter issue.
But there's also on that same psychological thing I was talking about is I was like, well, there's got to be a drop off of your ability to retain information and that sort of thing. And you may think, well, this is entertainment; it's not really work, like if you're doing something else. But it is work in a sense. You're having to absorb a lot of information. You have to figure out what's going on with the storyline and all these things. And there's only so much you can I guess absorb at once. And your brain can kind of get a little bit overloaded, and so you start to lose some of that stuff after about 90 minutes, 90 minutes to 2 hours. And so that's why I think, that's kind of like the ideal time to do a break, as then they can last for another 90 minutes or 2 hours, and finish out the film, whatever it is. And they might actually be more refreshed, have more of ability to actually, retain, I mean, I don't know, especially in Killers of the Flower Moon, it's a kind of an emotionally draining film from you get angry and frustrated about what's happening. And so to me, maybe having a break would allow you to kind of reset a little bit so then you can enjoy it again and I don't know.
Be energized for that second half almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, from what I understand, the theaters that were putting these intermissions in were doing it at like the 1 hour, 45-minute mark. And it was before the FBI scene. So it's even before that. So you're still dealing with that front half of the film without any kind of resolve or investigation into it.
Well, and that's the important thing, is to know where to put it so it's ideal for the storyline.
Well,
But
that's what I was going to get to next, is that I had the chance to speak with Thelma Schoonmaker, who is the editor on the film. So we mentioned this in the past podcast, but she's a longtime Martin Scorsese editor. She's worked with him on 20-something films. She's gotten, I think, 7 or 8 Academy Award nominations. She's won 3 times, all for Scorsese films. So I spoke with her and I said, could you predict that this conversation about intermissions would be coming out of this film, unintendedly maybe? And she said that everybody she's spoken with, and I understand this, loved the film and had good things to say about it and didn't criticize the length. She said there were films that are appropriate to have intermissions, and she cited Lawrence of Arabia as an example. And she said these films, like a Lawrence of Arabia, were carefully crafted to have an intermission. They were specifically shot in a certain way so that there would be one, whereas this film was a slow build, and she said that was important. It was important for that not to be interrupted, and that Killers of the Flower Moon never was intended to have an intermission. So that's from the editor, the thought of why the film was as long as it was. There's a story, there's a build up, there's they didn't want any interruption in the storytelling process. That's not to say that when you're streaming it later on you can take a break, but in that initial theatrical presentation, that's the thought that was into it. So right from the editor there, can't argue with it.
And I understand that. That's good to know that the artistic argument for it, because it's pretty easy to say, well, people need to be able to stand up and move around, stretch their legs and stuff. It's not really, physically healthy to sit in one place and not move for, 3.5, or if you add in the intro trailers and stuff, it's, approaching 4 hours. That's not, really healthy. You had mentioned that I don't know, did you read or see a video with Scorsese talking about longer films? Can you tell me?
I had seen, I don't know if it was an article or a YouTube video or something, where he was saying that, people stream these or binge watch these shows for hours at a time. My 3.5 hour movie, is no different than that. I mean, he's allowed to present this film any way he wants to. He's the filmmaker. That's the vision he has. Streaming stuff at home, I mean, you're not anchored to your chair. You come and go as you want. You pause it. You get up, use the restroom, get a drink, whatever it is. I think when it's in a theatrical scenario, you're committed to being there. You know that when you step out, the film's not going to stop and wait for you. So I think there's a different a mentality there when you're in a theater, that you're like, hey, I've got to either suck it up and sit through it, even if I'm not comfortable, or I'm going to miss something, or bail out, and that's what the consequences are.
Well, right. And binge watching doesn't mean that you don't ever take a break. I mean, we aren't living in idiocracy where we have chairs with toilets built into them and a Gatorade tube.
Right.
So yeah. Not yet anyway. There is something to being considerate of your audience, and the fact that having them sit there for that long is going to make them probably uncomfortable. Not everybody, but a good portion of people are going to become uncomfortable at some point. I certainly was getting a little antsy. There was a guy in my theater, granted a screening, who stood in the back row for the entire film. I think he was probably there to make sure nobody was filming anything, because it was a pre-release screening.
That could be true, yeah.
But I was like, I was imagining, and we didn't have the trailers at the beginning, but I was like 3 hours and 26 minutes just to be standing there. It's like, man, I don't know.
You know what? Going back, I mentioned a couple of things on the economics of a theater's thinking, meaning that you want people to use the candy stand. There was technology limitations. One other thing that I didn't mention, and I should, is that when you are a theater chain, you have to kind of plan out your screening schedule. You have to know that, okay, the film is X amount of length. You have to know how many trailers are going to go before it. A trailer is typically 2 minutes for an upcoming film. You may have 5 or 6 of those before a film starts. You've got your please silence your phone, trailer there. You have, anything else that they're promoting, Coca-Cola, the concession stand, American Express, whatever it is. So that all gets loaded in to the beginning of it also. And if you're a theater owner, you have to plan, well, the film is this long. I've got this many trailers before it. If you introduce an intermission, a 5-minute intermission, a 10-minute intermission, over the course of a day, 4 or 5 screenings, you've just taken up how much more time? And that could limit the number of screenings you can show. I mean, these films could go beyond midnight. It's 2 a.m. You're still showing films because you've now extended your day because of that extra 5 minutes here, extra 10, 15 minutes, whatever it is, and it pushes everything along. So there's a calculation that has to be done when you're figuring out which film is going into which theater, which seats, how much time it's going to take, and things like that. So there's a lot more to it than just like, it's a bathroom break type thing.
Yeah. So when we were talking before, I was thinking about how, it'd be nice to have an intermission. And then when I found out people were having intermissions, I thought, great, that sounds like an awesome idea. Why shouldn't a theater be able to do that? And then you find out there's this backlash and they're being told they can't do that. And it's like, well, why don't they have a right to? But then you understand that artistic aspect is like, well, it wasn't intended to be that way. It's like, yeah, but people's comfort. But then they're like, well, but no, you wouldn't even know where to cut it properly to not affect the flow of it. And I'm like, that's a good point too. I mean, it's hard to know exactly where to fall on this. I mean, if you are doing a 3 hour and 45 minute film, you might want to consider, hey, maybe we should find a good place that somebody could have an optional intermission if they wanted to offer that as to
Well,
their audience. I don't know.
that's a good point. Where do you put that intermission? Do you put it smack dab in the middle of a 3 hour movie at an hour and a half, at the hour and a half point, or do you look for a scene where things are fading to black and you kind of like say that's a good point to put a pause on things and then start it right back up? I mean, and who makes that decision is the next thing. Is it the theater owner? Is it the projectionist? I mean, who's making that
I mean,
decision?
That should be the editor and the director saying, hey, we'll put a note in here that, if people want to split it up, here's where they want to split it up at. I don't know.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was doing a little research about it and finding out some of the films and what some of the more recent films were, obviously we mentioned like Avengers Endgame was 3 hours. The Hateful Eight was longer and stuff. Director Wes Anderson, who I love some of his films. They're kind of quirky. They're really stylized. I really like Grand Budapest Hotel, The French Dispatch, Darjeeling Limited. He had a film out this year, Asteroid City, and it's only 105 minutes, so an hour and 45 minutes. And he had an intermission in his film because he tells his films in acts or chapters. And I guess at one point there is a intermission, break in there. But it's only 145 minutes. But it's a, kind of a quirky thing that he put in there. And I haven't seen the film, so I can't comment on specifically how they made it work. But I just thought that was kind of clever that he's like, you know what, I'm going to use this in my film.
That's funny because a few decades before that, Monty Python did the same thing with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is about the same length, but they have an intermission, I think, more for a comedic effect than anything,
Right.
So
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, so do you have any final thoughts or conclusion with regard to this topic?
I think this has brought up a interesting issue that studios may have to take into consideration now. I mean, we mentioned a couple of these films, Hateful Eight, Avengers Endgame, obviously this new film, Killers of the Flower Moon. Maybe studios have to think that if they're going to push that 3 hour limit, that they should consider maybe this should be a film with an intermission. The audience seems to appreciate it. The theater benefits because people are comfortable. Maybe they spend a little more money. People are still going to go back into the theater to see that second half. So it seems like everybody could win by doing it. So maybe it's opened up a conversation for consideration now. I think that's where we're at with this because nobody was talking about it prior to this film. And all of a sudden it's in a lot of different, publications, YouTube. There's a lot of criticism and it's all because of this film. So it really did spark a debate.
Well, and I want to reiterate that I thought it was a really good film. I enjoyed it. Even though I did say that it could have been an hour shorter, it still worked at the length that it was. One thing I want to say about once again, I delved into the psychological aspect of it a little bit, and you mentioned this in one of the other films that they actually would plan out where they were going to do their intermissions when they were shooting the film or editing and that sort of thing. And I was reading about that as well, and how they would actually use it as a tool, kind of like you were talking about as well with the Asteroid City or whatever. That you could actually use it to build up to this point and kind of leave it as a cliffhanger so people would want to come back to their seats. They're excited to see what's going on, but they have a chance to kind of refresh. And now we're ready for the rest of the story and finish it out. So usually that'd be kind of probably the end of your second act, rolling into your third act or whatever, But yeah, so I don't know. I think it's there's opportunities for the storytellers, the director, the writers, and the editor to take advantage of this if we're going to be seeing longer and longer films like that.
Definitely, yeah. Well, Heath, I want to thank you for inviting me onto this podcast.
Thanks, Mark. I always enjoy our conversations.